Okay, you are good to go, David. Yeah, I don't think.
All right. Well, I think this is everyone. So thank you all for coming out and hearing this presentation on the Menhaden industry of the Lower Cape Fear. My name is David Bennett. I'm the Curator of Maritime History for the North Carolina Maritime Museum System. And so hopefully y'all learned quite a bit today. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with the Menhaden industry of Carteret County because there's been quite a few publications on that part of the industry. Not so much for the Lower Cape Fear, which was actually quite active in the state's industry. So so for some reason, the slide's not advancing. Oh, there we go. All right. All right. So, of course, if you're not familiar with the Menhaden, it's a small, oily fish, not particularly edible, although the roe, the fish eggs, they are edible. They can be consumed, but it's primarily an industrial fish. So it's pressed for the oil, which is used in a wide variety of products, paint, omega-3 supplements, all sorts of products, cosmetics. There's also the fish meal, which has been used in fish fertilizer and animal feed. It's an incredibly important fish for particularly the southern fishery today. So in North Carolina, traditionally, the season starts either in late March, early April. The fish really start to hit North Carolina around May. And then in the fall, it's really active around mid-October through December, where there's 4 big runs of fish. And the Menhaden's a migratory fish. So it'll come up the coast in the spring and the summer, headed for more northern waters as well as sounds. And then in the fall, it'll travel back down south. And then in the fall, that part of the fish's life cycle, that's when it's big and it's larger and full of oil. And that's really when the industry is making its money off these fish. For the Southport region, for the Lower Cape Fear, their main fishing grounds went from Georgetown, South Carolina, all the way up to Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras was sort of the northern limit traditionally for those boats. However, in much later years, when the boats were bigger and more efficient, sometimes they would go all the way down to northern Florida to go fishing. So now we're really going to sort of get into the history of it, and it's a little complicated. So hopefully, it won't be too difficult to follow. The industry in the Lower Cape Fear, you had one factory that popped up in the early 1870s, wasn't around for very long. There was another factory that had popped up in the 1880s, but it wasn't around for very long either. The first real large modern Menhaden factory was started in 1900 by Josephus F. Bustles. And he was a Virginia native who grew up in the industry. His father owned a factory in Virginia, and he had been involved in every aspect of the business, from fishing on boats to working the floor in the factory. So he knew how everything worked. He came down to the Lower Cape Fear area in around 1894, 1895, looking for property to build a fish factory. And finally, in 1900, he bought a piece of property on the Cape Fear River and built one. He's also was noted as an inventor, and he invented several processes, including one called the bustles process, which we'll get into in a little bit. But this is his first factory, his first factory in North Carolina, the Atlantic Fisheries Company, which was several miles up the Cape Fear from Southport. And it's just below Brunswick town, the historic site. And so here's some of his inventions. He invented cooking and pressing apparatus, a cooker and press that were all combined into one machine. He also had a fertilizer material, or a fertilizer dryer, for drying out fish scrap. He invented a rendering and press, a press basically for pressing the oil out of fish. Another extracting press that he invented, similar but different. He also had this sort of feeding and disintegrating apparatus, which basically you could have, say, the fish. This would sort of connect the sort of the press to the dryer. So instead of having to remove all the fish by hand and putting them into the next machine, you had this sort of machine that was in between it, and it would help chop up the fish and get it all loosened up between those two machines. And so the bustles process, this is one of the processes in which he's famous for. It's basically automation of a Menhaden plant. So basically, he had from the time that fish were being offloaded from the factory, go right onto a conveyor, and then it would go into the cooker, and then to the press, then to the dryer, and then to a warehouse where the scrap would be cured and bagged. All of this was just one automated process. And it took about 20 minutes from beginning to end to complete. And this really cut down on the amount of labor that was required for these factories, cut down on labor costs. He was really focused on making these factories efficient. And so why the Cape Fear? Well, for one reason, the Cape Fear is sort of smack dab in the middle of the fishing grounds for the East Coast, for the Menhaden. But also Wilmington had a lot to offer. It had ports. So you had shipyards, marine railways, so you could maintain your vessels or even build vessels if you needed to. You also had, you could ship things by vessels. So fish oil, fish scrap, you could ship by ship. Also, a big railway hub was in Wilmington, so you could move your product by rail. And there's also all these large fertilizer companies within the vicinity. So you could sell your scrap directly to those companies, which they would then turn into fertilizer product. Next came the Cape Fear Fisheries Company, which was part of the American Fisheries Company. So around the turn of the century, you had the rise of the American Fisheries Company, which was this big conglomerate of Menhaden companies. And by some historical accounts, they call it the syndicate, is what people would call it. But anyways, they went around and were buying up Menhaden plants from Maine to Texas. And they decided to build one on the Cape Fear River, only 300 yards away from Bustles factory. And it was a huge plant. There's claims that it was producing 30,000 barrels of oil a day. I'm a little suspicious of that. It's probably more like 30,000 barrels of fish. But they had a bunch of boats. In 1905, they purchased the Atlantic Fisheries Company Bustles plant. And unfortunately, shortly thereafter, the whole company went bankrupt. But there was this sort of financial panic that was going on, a financial crisis in the United States at a time, which affected a lot of Menhaden factories. But the image right here is of Nathaniel Church, who was the president of the American Fisheries Company. He was instrumental in starting the Cape Fear Fisheries Company. And he's one of the most influential men in the Menhaden industry at the time. His nephew was James B. Church. He was a Midhayden boat captain for the Cape Fear Fisheries Company. And of course, he came from Tiverton, Rhode Island, came to Southport to fish for the company. He met a local woman, Laura de Clifford Weeks, married her, and then made Southport his permanent home. And he became very much involved in the Menhaden industry in that area and didn't retire until 1950. And he also owned a seafood business called the James B. Church Company, which unfortunately went belly up during the Great Depression. So that's the location of the two factories right there, right next door to each other. Then you had the Ocean Fisheries Company, which, so that was the Atlantic Fisheries Company. That plant was bought by the Ocean Fisheries Company. So this is where things get confusing because the location of these factories don't change. It's primarily the ownership and the names. So anyways, it's around for a while, fairly successful. It's purchased, a commanding share of the stock is purchased in 1912 by W.L. Messick, who is the brother-in-law of Bustles. And so more family working in this area. And then it goes belly up, it goes bankrupt in 1913. And then in 1914, Swan Finch and Company, they lease the factory out. And again, Nathaniel Church, at this time, he is now working for Swan Finch and Company, and he's managing this factory. And again, they're the factories. They're not changing location, just changing name and ownership. Okay.
Why were these companies failing? Was it management, or did it have something to do with fisheries, or?
So as I mentioned, sometimes there's these financial crises, and you'll see more of that that cause these companies to go under. Some of it's management. It's a precarious industry, and some of the sources aren't exactly clear. Sometimes it would appear that these companies might have been expanding faster or too quickly, and they would take on more debt than what was probably a good idea. And they couldn't pay back their mortgages in a timely manner. Sometimes they go belly up for that reason. So anyways, you have the Carolina Coast Products Company. You have Josephus Bustles is the president of it. His son, Irving Bustles, is the vice president of it. And they wind up purchasing the Cape Fear Fisheries Company after it goes bankrupt. His company goes bankrupt in 1915. It goes up for sale at public auction, and then he uses his personal money to buy it back. So he loses the factory, and then, or his company loses the factory, then he's able to personally purchase it. So again, locations aren't changing, just names. Now we're moving into World War I, which is actually gets really interesting for the industry in this area. And here's why. The demand for Menhaden products goes through the roof. During World War I, 11% of the explosives produced by the United States, or I should say 11% of the glycerin produced by the United States was derived from fish oil. And glycerin is a key ingredient in nitroglycerin, which is, which is an explosive. Fish oil was also used in tempering steel. So armor plating for warships, helmets, the tank has just come out, shell casings, bullets, you name it, it's being used. Also, it's being used to dress leather. So boots, belts, gloves, straps, saddles, packs, pouches, all sorts of applications for fish oil at this time. As the demand goes through the roof, so does the price. Fish scrap in 1914 was at $15 a ton. By 1918, it's $68 a ton. Fish oil went from 31 cents a gallon to $1.25 a gallon. So there's a lot of profit that's being made in a very short amount of time. And because of this profitability within the industry, there's also a lot of expansion. So during this time period, and the United States doesn't get involved in World War I until 1917, but there's this sort of gradual ramping up of the economy. And then things really take off in 1917 in terms of US economy. But anyways, Southport Fish Scrap and Oil starts up during this time period. Carolina Fish and Oil Company, previously known as the Carolina Coast Products Company. And then you have the Fisheries Products Company, which leases that property in 1916. By the end of 1917, they have purchased the Carolina Fish and Oil Factory, and they, in 1918, they alter their charter. Then you have the Neptune Fisheries Company is also started up, as well as Taylor's Fisheries Company starts up during this time period. And so here's what it looks like, the area looks like in 1914, 1915, in terms of factories. And then here's the sort of expansion that you have taking place. There's more factories now. There's about 4 factories. Yes, sir.
When you talk about fish oil, does this include whale?
No, this is just on Menhaden oil. So just one fish. So yeah, the question was, does this include whale oil? And this is, yeah, it's just Menhaden for the folks online. And so during this time period, this World War I time period, Josephus Bustles comes up with another invention in 1916, and that is processing what at the time they were calling fish water, but what we call today stick water. And basically what this fish water, stick water is, it's this waste product, this byproduct from pressing fish for fish oil and fish scrap. And it's just this nasty, oily water full of sort of like fish guts. But it's also really rich in all sorts of chemicals and minerals that are essential properties in fertilizers. And the people in this area in Brunswick and New Hampshire counties hated this stuff, and they were complaining about it. No one seemed to have a solution. Bustles figures out how to sort of filter and evaporate this nasty fish water, stick water, and recapture the ammonia, potash, and phosphoric acid into this sort of like cake-like material, which could then be used in fertilizer products. And by doing this, he's saving a lot of money and increasing his profits by 10%, all the while cutting down on this nasty pollution that the locals hate. And this process didn't get used in Carteret County until the late 1940s. So 30 years passed before this process, which was developed in the Southport area, made its way to Carteret. Also, during this World War I time period, the Department of Commerce is trying to really advocate for the idea of using Menhaden as a food fish, because there needs to be more meat and protein for the home front, because you've got your pork and your beef and your poultry, they're being shipped overseas for the troops and the allies to consume. And really, fish is really being advocated as sort of a domestic food. And they're saying you can smoke the Menhaden just like herring. And the federal government was experimenting with this in the fish factories in the Cape Fear region, particularly at the Neptune Fisheries factory. And this doesn't seem to really take off because it's not a very tasty fish. While all this heightened demand for Menhaden products is taking place, and with massive profit margins, you also have a lot of fish are available. In November 1917, set a record for the Cape Fear region. They had one school that was 3 miles long, half a mile wide, and 30 feet deep. And the boats from the Cape Fear region fished this one school from the Cape Fear all the way down to Georgetown, South Carolina. And it was a massive amount of fish that they brought back from it. But that's the type of schools that they're experiencing during this time period. So in 1918, Bustles leaves the Lower Cape Fear. He and another local fish factory manager, D.N. Chadwick Jr., who's with the Taylor company, they both resign their positions, and they decide that Bustles is going to start the Seminole Fertilizer and Oil Company in Fernandina Beach, Florida, and Chadwick is going to start the Planters Fertilizer and Oil Company in Georgetown, South Carolina. Unfortunately, Bustles doesn't get very far into this process before he dies. And that's sort of where he leaves the story. But before I get out of this World War I time period, I want to talk about the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company, because the folks with the Southport Historical Society have a wonderful photo collection that they were willing to share and let me use for this presentation. So this is a picture of the factory of the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company. It was started by the Dye brothers, so Charles and John Dye, who you may have heard about if you're familiar with the industry in Carteret County. They came to Carteret County in the 1880s and started a factory at Lennoxville, just outside of Beaufort, and they were very successful. They're the first really successful Menhaden business in North Carolina. There were multiple attempts prior to the 1880s, but they're the ones who really figure out how to make the business work. And so in 1914, they go down to Southport and they start the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company. By this time, Charles is so advanced in years, he doesn't seem to be really all that involved with the company, more like a silent partner. But his younger brother, John, who is shown in this portrait right here, he's the one who's really running the business in conjunction with his vice president and general manager, Charles Gauss. And this gentleman right here, this is Charles Gauss. I'm highlighting right here. And sort of zoomed in, this is the location of the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil. It's a few miles west of Southport on the Elizabeth River, not far from where the airport is today. And also it's right next door to the Highway 133 bridge if you're going to the Oak Island area. So anyways, here's one of their boats. This is the Minnesota. It looks like a converted yacht. Here's another one of their boats underway. That's the Nellie B. Dye, which operated at one point out of the Dye Brothers factory here in Beaufort. And now I'm going to shortly sort of get into the process of catching the Menhaden. So you'd have one or two guys up in the crow's nest or potentially a cross tree, and they would be looking for the fish, and they'd be looking for the sort of reddish color in the water, which might indicate Menhaden or jumping fish, presence of seabirds, that sort of thing. And then once they've confirmed that they've spotted a school of fish, they'd stop the boat and they'd lower their purse net boats into the water. And this is what one of your purse boats looks like hanging from the davits of a Menhaden boat. And then you'd have two purse boats would go out in the water accompanied by a striker boat. The job of the striker boat or the dry boat is to stay ahead of the Menhaden school. And then the two purse boats would then go around the school, paying out the net and sort of encircle the school that way. And then once they, the two purse net boats would meet up with the striker boat, bring their net together and start hulling it in. And then the Menhaden boat at that time would come alongside the purse net boats in the seine, and they would harden the net and start bringing the fish in. And then they would use these giant dip nets to then bail the fish out of the purse net and bring it aboard and dump the fish into the hold. And then once the hold was full of fish, the Menhaden boat would steam back to the factory, and then they would pull up to the factory's docks where they had an elevator, which was lowered down into the hold, which was sort of like a bucket. It's a bucket system, sort of, and they would just scoop the fish out, and that would then go on conveyor into the factory. It would go into the cooker. They would cook the fish at high pressure and high temperatures. And then from the cooker, they would go to what's shown here is the press. This is a continuous screw press. And then from the press, the fish scrap would then go to this giant dryer, which is that metal cylinder right there. And then from the dryer, it would go to a warehouse where the fish scrap would cure and finish drying out. And then men would start bagging it by hand. And then here's a warehouse full of fish scrap ready to be shipped out. The fish oil that was pressed or squeezed out of the fish would then wind up in these concrete tanks outside, where they would just let all the sort of impurities settle out of the oil into the bottom. So any sort of fish scales or any guts that made it to this point would settle to the bottom. And then they'd pump the oil from one tank to the next and just can let all the impurities filter out. And then they'd skim it out, put it into a metal tank, and then they would barrel the oil up that way. And again, these are all photos from this one factory. And here's some more of these fish barrels, or these oil barrels getting ready to be shipped. And in the background here, you can't see it really well, but there's all these cottages that are right next door to the factory. And this is where the factory provided free housing for their workers, because these factories are working 24 hours a day during the fishing season. And so these guys, some of them are from out of town, some of these workers. And so they need a place to stay, and that's where they would stay. And they're also provided with free meals as well. And there's a stock certificate for the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company. So now we're going to move to the 1920s, which where we get into a period of financial hardship for these factories. So 1919, World War I ends on November 11th, 1918. Right after that, wartime production just goes into serious decline until there's just not much weapons manufacturing going on. And this causes a recession within the economy. In addition, you've got a bunch of troops that are coming back, and they're having a hard time finding jobs. It's just sort of a beginnings of a rough time for the US economy. And there's some factories that open up during this time period at the last minute, the Southport Fish and Oil Company and the Cape Fear Fertilizer Company, which, so here's where all the factories are at this time in 1919. And you've got the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company all the way out or at the mouth of the Southport River. And the Cape Fear Fish Fertilizer Company is just a couple of miles north of Southport. During this time period, the price of Menhaden products, so fish scrap and fish oil, fall to pre-wartime prices. So we're talking about 30 cents a gallon for fish oil, where it had been, as high as $1.25 or more. And you had all this expansion within the industry, and there's a lot of competition, and there's just not enough business going around. At the same time, so prior to the war, most of the glycerin being produced was being produced from fish oil from China and Japan. And so once the war ends, the US goes back to buying glycerin from Japan and China, and it's continuing to drive the price of fish oil down. And a bunch of Menhaden companies are actually petitioning the US government to place regressive taxes or duties on the Japanese. And so you lose the Charlotte Fish and Oil Company in 1921, which is then bought up by Lindsay Fisheries Company. The Taylor Fisheries Company goes under in 1922 after not being able to afford to stay open in 1921. Neptune Fisheries goes under in 1922, not being able to afford to be active for two years, and is bought by the Midhayden Products Corporation, which is part of a much larger company, the Consolidated Fisheries Company. And so this is what things look like in 1922 in terms of locations of the factories and who owns them. Also in 1922, there's a severe labor shortage that's taking place within the Lower Cape Fear. And a lot of this has to do with an exodus of African Americans from the region, or the Great Migration, which took place from about 1910 to 1940. So there's actually a lot of stuff that happened leading up to this point. So in 1898 to about 1900, you had a white supremacy campaign that swept through North Carolina. It's very political. It had a lot to do with the Democrat Party trying to take control back from the Republican Party, and race was pushed to the forefront. And a lot of stuff happened, unfortunate things happened, like disenfranchisement of African Americans in North Carolina. In 1905, there was a continuation of this white supremacy campaign within the Cape Fear region, where they were trying to displace Black laborers by bringing in immigrants. They had tried to bring in Northern European immigrants, so Germans, Swedes, that sort of thing. It didn't really work out too well, so they resorted to bringing in Italian laborers. And they did this within the Menhaden factories, which is sort of mind-blowing because African Americans have been traditionally the primary labor force for this industry. So basically telling African Americans that they're no longer wanted or needed. This wasn't really sustainable because a lot of the Italians that they're bringing in couldn't speak English. And they're only seasonal workers. So after the Menhaden season was over, a lot of them left. They were more successfully used within the agriculture business of this region. Then in 1917, you're still having a lot of African Americans leaving the area. And some of these Menhaden factories start trying to offer enticements to retain their Black labor. Better salaries, better working conditions, better food, better accommodations at the factories. Still doesn't quite work out. The president of the Fisheries Products Company actually wrote a letter to the governor of North Carolina during World War I, trying to figure out a way to try and get the governor to actually force Black people to work in these factories. Of course, that doesn't go anywhere. However, in 1922, the labor situation is so dire that the president of the Fisheries Products Company, as well as some other corporate executives from some of the fertilizer companies in this area, they go to the mayor of Wilmington and they try and get the enforcement of vagrant laws. So basically what the mayor of Wilmington did was he told the police to go out and start arresting Black men who weren't working and take them to the factories and force them to work. That doesn't really work out either. So they start trying to pull labor from Raleigh, Charlotte, Greensboro, Winston-Salem. Those cities were having their own crisis within labor. So they wind up drawing Mexican labor from Texas to actually fill in at these factories, which is a good little, this is a good little segue to really talk about Black watermen and factory workers, since I did mention they are the backbone of the industry. And if you look at the census records for this region, some of the top professions for the coastal communities in Brunswick County, as well as the communities along the Cape Fear River, was fishing, working on a fish boat, or working in a fish factory. And you actually had small communities, African Americans you know, complete with schools and churches popping up around some of these fish factories. They were also, a lot of these families who were involved in these factories own their own farms. Farm work's seasonal, fishing seasonal. However, sometimes these two activities clashed with one another, which I suspect is what drove a lot of the tension between the factory owners and their staff. So in 1917, you have the Portsmouth Fisheries Company is started on Portsmouth Island. Things don't really pan out on Portsmouth Island because it's way too isolated. They're having to get all their product to Morehead City to be shipped out. Wasn't cost effective. So Charles Wallace of Morehead City moved his factory from Portsmouth Island to Southport in 1922, where he was much more successful and profitable. And he really saw the potential of Southport as a viable area for fishing. He already owns some Menhaden factories in Carteret County, so he didn't need to stick another one here. And so there's a map showing you where Portsmouth is and the move down to Southport. Yes, ma'am. The first factory here in Carteret County was 1865 on Harker's Island. Then you also have the Buck Island Fisheries, established in 1923 off of Dutchman's Creek, which is right off the Elizabeth River, just outside of Southport. And John A. Guthrie was the president. He's from Morehead City. He had been involved in the Menhaden industry of Carteret County previously. And they had three boats at this factory. We don't really know a whole lot about this factory because it wasn't around for very long. But this is 1925, where everything's located. So there's a lot of factories at this point. There's some unfortunate things that happened in the 1920s, and a lot of it surrounds securities fraud and embezzlement, which causes two factories to fail. The Cape Fear Fish Fertilizer Company goes under because it is quickly discovered that the people who are running the company were involved in embezzlement, and they're prosecuted and the company is dissolved. The Fisheries Products Company is a little bit more interesting, and it's an extremely complicated situation that I'll briefly try to describe to y'all. But it's interesting because the Fisheries Product Company at this time was one of the largest Menhaden companies, if not the largest, in the United States. So they started off renting their factory in 1916 on the Cape Fear River. By 1918, they owned it. They spent a tremendous amount of money overhauling, expanding the factory. They expanded their fleet to 12 boats. After World War I, they expanded their fleet to 20 boats. And they had other Menhaden factories. They owned the largest Menhaden factory in the United States in Promised Land, New York. They also owned a factory in Lewes, Delaware. I think they also had one in Norfolk. They extended their dock 500 feet, and they built a separate fertilizer factory, $1 million factory, just up the river from their fish factory. And here's an image of what it looked like. And this is massive. And most of the fish factories on the Cape Fear River were really big and probably similar in size to this one. But this is the only image that we have of a fish factory that's directly on the Cape Fear River. And I got some pictures of their boats. So I think that this is the Alaska right here. This is the Amagansett, which we actually have an artifact from. We have the life ring from this boat that's on display here in the museum. This is the J.W. French. The Leander Wilcox. the Martin J. Marin. The few days. Yeah. The Walter Adams. And then here's a stock certificate from the Fisheries Product Company. And so the main problem, we had multiple problems with this company, but they were involved in securities fraud. So basically what they were doing was they were targeting the people that they were targeting were farmers from North Carolina and South Carolina, and they were overvaluing their company. They weren't being honest with how much their company was worth and what their true liabilities were, or how much money they actually owed people. And some things in the early 20s didn't seem quite right. They started sending letters out to their stockholders saying, hey, y'all are farmers. Instead of getting cash dividends, how about we send you fertilizer instead? And a bunch of people said, that's weird. We don't want fertilizer. We want cash. You know, and then finally in March 1924, the South Carolina legislature contacted the governor of North Carolina as well as the General Assembly and asked them to investigate the Fisheries Products Company, which they did. And some other things came out that year. In September, there's this New York insurance company that filed a complaint that a $10,000 insurance bill had gone unpaid by the Fishery Products Company, which just, you know, caused people to look more and more into this company. And by October, an audit discovered that the company only had $68.30 on hand, and they owed thousands and thousands of dollars to people. And then in November, it was discovered that North Carolina banking laws had been violated. And so quickly, this issue was litigated. Lawsuits went on for years. However, the officers of the company got off scot-free. And they continued to have a very successful career in the Menhaden industry. The guys who owned this company went on to own Consolidated Fisheries later on. So the St. Phillips Fisheries Company starts up in 1927. It buys up the Fisheries Products Company factory on the Cape Fear River. Not a good time though, because we're quickly approaching the Great Depression. So other problems in the 20s, Lindsay Fisheries goes under. Buck Island Fisheries caught fire, burned down. They were able to save a couple of the boats that were at dock, but the company was only insured for $15,000 when its assets were valued at over $30,000. And that stuff went up in smoke, so they couldn't afford to rebuild. Brunswick Fish and Oil, kind of complicated situation. The president, he died, and the company owed him personally a lot of money, so his estate sued the company. In addition, there's other companies that were owed money as well. And so the people who were left in charge kind of threw up their hands and said, let's just get rid of this thing. And so they dissolved the company, and it's bought up by Edward Rinnenberg and Sons, which is not a Menhaden company. What they were a manufacturer of equipment that went into manufacturing fish oil and fish scrap. So presses, dryers, that kind of thing. That's what this company made. And I don't think they ever utilized this site as a fish factory ever again. And so here's what things look like right before we go into, well, actually, yeah. Sorry, that's the Buck Island Fisheries is gone. Yeah, but anyways, 1929 to 1939, we go into the Great Depression. So just a quick recap, who survived this long? We've got the Federal Fisheries Company, which in 1925 renamed itself the Edwards Company of Carolina, which in 1927 renamed itself the Edward Fisheries Company. Complicated, same company, just different names, same ownership, just different names. Portsmouth Fisheries Company is still around. St. Phillips is still around. Menhaden Products is still around. And Southport Fish Scrap and Oil is still around as well. However, by 1930, Edwards Fisheries goes bankrupt and they fail to pay their taxes. They go into tax foreclosure and the county takes their property. So, and that site is never used again as a fish factory. Then some of the big fish factories that are left on the Cape Fear River, St. Phillips and the Menhaden Corporation, they can't afford to stay in business because, as you saw from that picture of like the fisheries product company, that's then the St. Phillips. They can't afford to keep that massive factory going during the Depression. So they shut down, they maintain the property, and they keep putting out these newspaper articles saying, hey, we're going to reopen, we're going to reopen, we're going to reopen. Well, they never reopen. And then in 1953, the federal government comes and takes the land by eminent domain because they're building the Sunny Point Army Maritime Terminal on the Cape Fear River, and they want a buffer zone between the Maritime Terminal and the rest of the world. So there's nothing, it's just open field where those factories are. The Portsmouth Fisheries Company went bankrupt in 1933, and it was sold to the Brunswick Navigation Company. And the Brunswick Navigation Company became Southport's most active and successful fish factory during the Great Depression. They're the ones who are able to work every season without interruption. And kind of zoomed in, so the Brunswick Navigation Company is right next door to Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company on the Elizabeth River. Brunswick Navigation, the road that's running up from it, that's Fish Factory Road. Then by 1936, the Southport Fish Scrap and Oil Company had finally gone bankrupt. By this time, Charles Gauss he owned the company. John Day had passed away. And it is sold to Llewellyn Phillips and his family of Morehead City, which were very big in the Menhaden industry. They continued to operate the fish factory. Phillips Island, as you're crossing the bridge from Morehead City over to Radio Island, you can look out to the left. There's that island with the brick smokestack, Phillips Island, named for the family. And so, again, this is kind of roughly what the factory would have looked like at this time. And then same location, just different ownership. And at this point, the Menhaden industry is now concentrated around Southport. It's the stuff up on the Cape Fear River is dead. And then we're moving into World War II. So 1940 was a sort of unforgiving year for the Southport Menhaden industry. You had rough weather, which hampered the summer and spring fisheries. None of the boats had full loads of fish in the fall. Even the food fish industry, shrimping, which was massive in Southport, they weren't even catching that much shrimp. So all around the commercial industry, 1940 was a rough year for Southport. 1941, things were improving, still a lot of rough weather during the summertime. They found more success fishing off of Georgetown, South Carolina, but there's even rough weather down there that was damaging boats. But some of the boats were catching really heavy loads, weighing the boats down. Then in 1941, right before the US enters World War II, Llewellyn Phillips leaves Southport. He abandons his factory, and that leaves just Brunswick Navigation as the only active Menhaden plant in Southport during World War II. And it was rough during World War II for Southport. Southport fell within strategic waters because of the port of Wilmington. And so the Menhaden boats, because of this reason, as well as the U-boat threat off our coast in 1942, they couldn't go beyond 3 miles offshore, and they couldn't be out after dark. And then the military set up a firing range between Schlote Inlet and Bald Head Island. So this is the area where the only possible area where they really could have fished. And the military decided to set up a firing range right there, kind of limiting when they could actually go out and fish even more. On top of that, the U.S. Navy started requisitioning Menhaden boats owned by the Brunswick Navigation Company to use as patrol boats, looking for submarines, U-boats off our coast. Got a labor shortage. There wasn't enough fishermen because they were going off to war, or they're going to the shipyards for work in Wilmington building Liberty ships. More consistent work, better pay in the shipyards. There's material shortages due to rationing, so fuel, engines, metal, etc. Just there wasn't enough to actually run and maintain your boats and factories at the time. So the state of North Carolina felt so bad for the Menhaden industry in this region because they're losing all this money that they actually allowed Menhaden boats to go out and purse net for mullet and other food fish, which had been illegal in North Carolina for a very long time. And but the home front needed more protein, they need more meat, need more fish for domestic consumption, and they also felt bad for the loss of revenue. But this really upset the mullet fishermen. The mullet fishermen and the Menhaden fishermen in this region of the state had been clashing ever since the industry really took off around the turn of the century. They never really saw eye to eye because the mullet industry had been in continual decline. And the mullet fishermen really kind of blamed the Menhaden industry due to bycatch, that sort of thing. They also blamed the shrimp industry as well. Then towards the end of World War II, the industry started bouncing back because restrictions were eased. There is more fuel, more metal, more men starting to come back. And so they could actually do business more. They could actually operate after dark, go farther offshore. They could go all the way to Beaufort, Morehead City in the fall to go fishing. So things were starting to get back to normal. And then we enter this era of sort of post-war prosperity and innovation within the industry. So for this area, for the Southport area, the companies started buying up these surplus Navy minesweepers and converting them into Menhaden boats, and they could go faster and they could hold more fish. They're just very efficient. And Brunswick Navigation started off with about 3 of these boats, Plaxico, Brunswick, and George C. Nickerson. Then you had the birth of aerial spotting right after World War II. Paul Waters of Southport, he was a World War II pilot. He came back home after the war and went to the Menhaden factories and said, hey, I can fly out over the ocean and spot the schools and radio back to you and tell you where they are. And he made a career out of it. And he's the guy that pioneered this method. He flew out of Brunswick and Carteret counties working with Menhaden boats. And he inspired a lot of people to do this. The companies, he owned his own independent company, but I believe. But a lot of factories started buying aircraft and employing pilots. And this method spread up and down the coast, and it also spread internationally. Radios became more common in vessels after the war. So there's this ship-to-shore communication as well as communication between ships and aircraft where they can coordinate their activities and go after fish more efficiently. Eventually you have the hydraulic power block. So this motorized block and tackle system where rather than having a bunch of men hauling in the nets and hardening them, you've got a machine that can do it for you. So you're cutting your labor down dramatically. You're cutting your costs down dramatically. Unfortunately, you start to lose certain traditions like the singing of the shanties. While these men were, in the past, where all these men were really straining to haul in these nets, they're singing songs to sort of, urge each other on. And when you have machines doing that, you don't need to sing so much anymore. Then you have nylon is replacing cotton twine. So your nets are more durable, they're cheaper to buy and less expensive to maintain. You also have the centrifugal pump. So this pump that works kind of like a giant vacuum cleaner that's able to suck all the fish out of your purse net or out of the hold of your ship. So no more dip nets. No, don't even have to have rely on elevators as much anymore. A more efficient industry. Then you also had some new factories pop up. You had the Sanders Company from Virginia came down, and they had a Menhaden plant called Fish Factory Number 1. They built a 3-story Menhaden plant on an old Navy barge that was left over from World War II. And they owned a little bit of land right off the Elizabeth River where they could store like fish oil and fish scrap, but all the processing is done onshore and all the crew accommodations are on board. And they had one Midhayden boat, a big former Navy boat that they converted into a Midhayden boat, the Big Chief. But this is what the factory looked like, moored right off the Elizabeth River. And then this is a picture of it after Hurricane Hazel came through in 1954 and washed half the boat up onto the land. The company went under in 1953 when the president died and the company went bankrupt. And then they had this factory and they were trying to figure out what to do with it. And then in 54, Hazel came and washed it up. It was a disaster, lots of litigation. The factory was salvaged and sold to a company on the West Coast. Then you have Southport Fisheries starts up in 1951. It is on the west side of the Highway 133 drawbridge. That's the drawbridge that goes from Southport to Oak Island in Long Beach. They had a couple of minesweepers, 80 employees. It was pretty successful early on. I think the first couple of weeks, I think it was by week 3 that they're in operation, they caught like 500,000 fish in one day. Had just incredible landings. Unfortunately, and this is actually a better image where you can actually kind of check things out here. But unfortunately, it doesn't last too long. And then so this is what things look like in the 50s for Southport. Everything's concentrated on the Elizabeth River, just west of Southport. So even though there's all this progress, all this innovation that's going on in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, things weren't all that great in Southport. You had a strike that took place for several months in 1952. Workers from all the factories decided to coordinate an effort, go on strike. And initially the issue was that the workers had joined the Furriers and Leather Workers Union. And all they wanted was recognition of their union. They weren't getting into wages or benefits or anything like that. It was just, we want the owners to recognize our union. Well, the owners accused them of communist ties and accused the union of having communist ties, that kind of thing. So they weren't going to give in to any of the demands. So as time went on, the conversation went more from acknowledgement of the union to wages and working conditions. And things became very organized where you had unions outside of the area. People from all over the United States started sending food and money into Southport to support the fishermen and their families. They could only go so long, though, without working, and the thing just sort of fizzled out. And unfortunately, the Menhaden workers don't seem to have gotten their way with this particular instance. And similar instances occurred in Carteret County, and these unions didn't get anywhere within the Menhaden industry in Carteret County either. Also during this time period, the shrimp industry in Southport went through some similar things. They didn't really get anywhere either. Now we're moving into the real decline of the industry on the Lower Cape Fear. So the Southport Fisheries Company went bankrupt in 1962, and it was quickly snatched up by the North Carolina Menhaden Company, which is an interesting company because it took me forever to figure out that the North Carolina Menhaden Company was actually owned by the Smith Meal Company. Yeah, so like Smith Meal Company had these big factories all over the United States, had a big factory here in Beaufort, and they had the smaller one down in Southport that they purchased. It was only really consistently in operation until 1968. After that, the company started going decline as they were getting out of the business. Things really went downhill in the summer of 1972 when one of their tanks containing acid used in the processing of fish scrap exploded. The superintendent of the factory was lifted off his feet and blown away 75 feet. He was okay. Imagine he probably had a concussion or something. But one of the fuel tanks was perforated and over 15,000 gallons of fuel spilled into the ICW. There's a big federal cleanup and a lawsuit to boot. And so the property was then sold in 1977. And after that, Standard Products Company comes in and they buy up the plant and the boats that are held by Brunswick Navigation. Prior to this, they bought some land that is owned by Phillips, but I guess it wasn't large enough to put a factory there. I'm not sure why they didn't start a factory earlier, but in '65 they did. And from what I've read, it seems like the company was actually more interested in the ships than they were the factory, although they operated the factory for quite some time. And so here's some images from Standard Products. Here's one of these converted Navy trawlers. And there's your purse net boats, the men working in that. And hardening the net, the Menhaden, and the fish inside the vessel, guy up to his knees in Menhaden. And so why did things fall apart at the end in the 70s and 80s for the industry in the Lower Cape Fear? And the reason is, well, one of the reasons is the price of Menhaden products went into decline. So the industry became less and less profitable. One of the factors driving the prices down was you had imported Menhaden products coming in. For instance, Peru was one of these localities where Menhaden was being shipped in from. There's some large fluctuations that took place within the fish stocks. So there's some unpredictability within the business. But if you really look at trends for the Menhaden industry, there's a lot of fluctuations that do take place over the years. And it's hard to predict what the fish will do from one year to the next. There's consolidation that was going within the industry. So you had these larger companies were buying up smaller factories, which was also making business difficult and less certain. Then the people in the area really didn't like the odor anymore. especially as they transition more to a tourist-based industry. Then as well, standard products got in trouble for pollution in the early 1980s. They had some employees that were actually pumping caustic chemicals right into the ICW, and they were caught in the act. And so they were penalized by the state and federal government. Then there's all these fish spills that take place. So you have these Menhaden boats that are operating offshore, and their nets tear, and all these dead fish wash ashore onto the beaches. And it's like the height of summer tourist season, and all these people are coming down, spending a week at the beach, and there's all this dead, rotting fish. Now, the factories would own up to this, and they would pay for the cleanup, but still, the tourists are inconvenienced, and it's annoying for the tourism-based businesses. And then there's all these clashes that are happening with between the Menhaden industry and the sports fishing industry, particularly when you've got this rise of like these king mackerel tournaments that are taking place down in this region. And it's just, you've got these two classes of fishermen that just aren't getting along with each other. They're not seeing eye to eye. And all of this sort of culminates in legislation that basically makes business much more difficult in the lower Cape Fear region for the Menhaden industry. These boats are having, the laws are pushing these boats farther offshore. And this part of North Carolina is really where is sort of the beginning of the end for the industry in terms of legislation being passed. And that's basically what I have for this presentation, sort of how things end. It was once this massive industry, you know, in the early 20th century during World War I, and then it just slowly declines and disappears. So, yes.
I remember the Menhaden
plant. For the folks online, the question is, when did the last Menhaden plant in Beaufort quit operating? And that was in 2005, I believe. Is there any more questions?
Is Menhaden processed in the U.S. at all?
Yes, it's processed in Virginia, as well as the Gulf.
So where is it all coming from? Is it all not fished out here at all anymore at all?
No, it's not fished commercially anymore in North Carolina. Not within North Carolina waters, I should say.
So the same volume of fish exists on the coast?
You know, I haven't really studied the current landings since the industry has disappeared from North Carolina. But I was looking on the Marine Fisheries website, and according to Division of Marine Fisheries, the Menhaden, North Carolina, are not overfished. But we have backed off, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about the volume, but it is a much more consolidated industry. Yeah, it's really a few companies that are really dominating now. Right.
Basically, the fish itself is in a real good shape. Yeah.
Is the Menhaden products, I mean, have they expanded? I mean, from glycerin and fertilizer and
So the question is, have the Menhaden products expanded? And there's a lot of different products. There's all sorts of cosmetics that use the oil, medicines,
Aquaculture.
yeah, aquaculture, bait. It's big in the bait industry. If you like fishing for crabs, there's all sorts. If you go and look at the exhibit here in the museum, they actually display all sorts of different products that Menhaden are used in.
So these early wooden boats, before they were commissioning the war boats in the southeast, where did one company had 20 boats at one time? Where were they wooden boats?
Yeah, so for the folks who are still listening online, the questions, the wooden boats, where are they coming from? Were they coming from up north? And yeah, a lot of these boats that are being used in the Cape Fear region, they are they're coming from they're coming down from up north. So like when I was talking earlier in the presentation, talking about like the American Fisheries Company or even the Fisheries Products Company. So those boats might fish in North Carolina for a few months in the spring and then a few months or a couple months in the fall. In between, they're following the fish up north. And because these much larger companies have factories in place like, New York or Lewes, Delaware, or up in the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, they move up the coast with the schools and they're working in conjunction with those factories up there. Some of these boats were also being leased from other companies. So some of the companies down in the Cape Fear region didn't necessarily own their boats, but they were renting them from other companies as well. And looking at a lot of the northern newspapers can be a good source on following the boats and learning who actually owns what boat and who the captains are and where their hometowns. There's so much information that can be pulled. But yes.
And they were fishing Menhaden up there too. They were designed for that fishery.
Yep. They're fishing up and down the coast. And some of those boats were going as far south as Florida in some cases. But that was, before they started going to the converted Navy minesweepers and salvage boats.
Just a quick question. You might have mentioned this in the presentation, but I'm just curious, where do these Menhaden actually spawn?
There's a variety of locations. Some of them I believe spawn in the Sounds of North Carolina, and then others go farther north, or where do they mate? I forget. I haven't spent quite as much time looking at the life cycle of the Menhaden, but yeah, I do know that by the fall they're mature when they're coming back into North Carolina waters. Yes. Yeah.
Talked about the March 5th event yet? Because
no, I haven't gotten to that.
Joseph Smith, who is he's a retired NOAA scientist, is giving a presentation, and he will tell you all about the biology of the Menhaden. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be available online.
I believe so. So I was just reminded that on March 5th here at the North Carolina Maritime Museum, we're going to have an educational event all about the Menhaden industry in North Carolina, particularly Carteret County. And we're going to have people talk about the biology of the Menhaden. We're going to talk about the history of the industry in Carteret County. And we're also going to have past Menhaden captains and crew member come and talk about their experiences as well. So it'd be a real interesting event. So, and I believe that starts at 10 o'clock on Saturday, March the 5th. You can go online to the North Carolina Maritime Museum at Beaufort's website to reserve a seat for yourself. And it's free to the public. All right. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
You did a good job.
Uh-oh.